What's up, my Canadian cousins? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be looking at another military history, and it is Camp X, which, from what I understand, was a spy training school in World War II in Canada that was designed by the British, I believe, to train American and Canadian intelligence operatives, and maybe precursor to some special forces, I think. I don't know. My father, my dad was in Army intelligence in NATO during during the Vietnam War, a Cold Warrior with the Soviets and East Germans and the Soviet bloc. That makes me somewhat interested in this because I know that, the U.S. Has a very capable intelligence apparatus, but it didn't always, and the British were far ahead of us during World War II. We're all together, the British, the UK, Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing pact, and we are all together in that. But, I think that this Camp X is probably going to be pretty interesting as the precursor to the birth of U.S. intelligence, which we, learned on Canadian soil from our British allies. Without further ado, my friends, please like and subscribe if you're so inclined, and I'll see you on the flip side.
It was the most secret training facility in the Western Hemisphere, and it contained the most cutting-edge spy technology of its time. It was also the site of the most mysterious wartime deaths in World War II history, and where some of the Allies' top spies were forged, including famous author Roald Dahl. One day before Pearl Harbor.
Roald Dahl. That's very funny, because just today, my 10-year-old daughter, who's a prolific reader, is reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and she literally said to me, "Daddy, Willy Wonka is more whimsical in the book than he was in the movie," which I thought was hilarious. Sorry.
Camp X officially opened its door. The facility was so secret that even Prime Minister of Canada Mackenzie King had no idea it existed right in his own nation's backyard. The sprawling training grounds in southern Canada had one simple purpose: prepare Canadian and American spies for the war against the Nazis. The United States might have been neutral, but President Roosevelt still favored supporting Britain and France over the Nazis. However, the U.S. public was sick of European wars, and formally declaring war on Germany would have been political suicide. Instead, the United States initiated several key programs to help the Allies stem the tide of Nazi Germany, including the famous Lend-Lease Act that saw many American warships end up in the hands of the British. But Roosevelt didn't think the U.S. could stay neutral for long.
I mean, that's overly simplistic. Yes, that's absolutely true that the United States had a political leaning towards neutrality or independence, really more, not getting involved in another European war. But public opinion gradually shifted, and FDR was actually brilliant at taking the people along without doing it too quickly so that it backfired on him, and FDR maneuvering to get the country ready. Japan didn't help things by bombing Pearl Harbor, and then Hitler, being the idiot that he was, declared war on us immediately after that, and then we were all in. But many U.S. merchant marines lost their lives in the earlier period of time, and a lot of people don't appreciate what they did because they weren't combatants. They were sitting ducks in these convoys that went over to the European theater and had very little armaments, and were our first casualties of war several years before we ever got involved. Anyway, I'm digressing, going down a rabbit hole.
At the rate the war was going, Britain would eventually, and if that happened, Nazi Germany would control all of Europe. As he secretly prepared for war, though one thing was abundantly clear: the United States was far from ready. The nation had no official intelligence agency, and even less experience conducting spy operations. If the U.S. was to join the war effort, it would need a very quick crash course on spying. Luckily, Britain was only too happy to repay the US for its war material by training up its first official spies. A nation with a vast spy network, Britain had plenty of experience in intelligence gathering, sabotage, and recruiting partisans, all the critical skills of a World War II spy. But the US's official neutral stance meant nobody could know Britain was training the first generation of American spies. So British advisors began to help the US create its first intelligence agency covertly. They opened up an office in New York City called British Passport Control, which served as a direct liaison with the Americans and the Special Operations Executive, a British espionage outfit. As the US gathered together suitable recruits for its first permanent national intelligence agency, they would need a place where training could take place covertly. Building such a facility in the US was out of the question. If word got out that the British were training American spies, it would be a violation of the US's public's desire to stay out of the war. Thus, Canada was chosen instead. It had remote enough areas that German spies would have difficulty learning of the operation, let alone reaching it, and the Canadian people supported the British war effort. Despite their support, though, the Canadians wanted to join the war on their own as an independent nation, and thus the existence of Camp X was kept secret even from the Canadian Prime Minister for fear he would shut it down. As we'll see later, Germany might have been all too aware of the top-secret camp, though. Vancouver businessman A.J. Taylor was paid off to buy 260 acres near Oshawa, Ontario, under a fake real estate company's name. Then construction began on barracks, classrooms, and a radio equipment room that would become known as the Hydra. It would be from here that some of the most important intelligence of World War II would pass, but first Camp X had to get started on training recruits. The terrain was perfect for training spies and undercover agents. The sprawling compound included hills, forests, swamps, and even a long stretch of coastline to train in boat handling and swimming. The frigid waters of Lake Ontario perfectly simulated the bone-shattering chill of the Atlantic and Mediterranean in the winter, and given that many operatives would end up being inserted behind enemy lines via submarine, made for perfect swimming and boating practice before the real deal. All training was handled by British instructors who had vast experience in intelligence gathering and guerrilla warfare, thanks to the sprawling nature of the British Empire. Even before World War II, British agents had been in operation everywhere from Turkey to South Africa and China, lending them a degree of experience the Canadians and Americans could only dream of. Thus, the entire training regimen was left up to the expertise of each instructor. One of the first skills Camp X recruits learned was map making and land navigation, integral skills for any spy operating behind enemy lines. The sprawling wilds of Camp X were perfect for land navigation exercises, and the techniques taught at Camp X remain in use even by regular U.S. Armed Forces today. Next, recruits would learn how to move around stealthily, which included lessons in active and passive camouflage. These skills, too, continue to be taught to modern American and Canadian military forces and include the application of camo paint, field camouflage of the individual and equipment, and more passive techniques such as where to stand within the illumination of lamps and streetlights so as to...
So, I'm trying to understand something. I mean, they said that they were keeping this secret from Mackenzie King. He was the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, right? And, but it seems like the Canadian military was participating in this. So was the military hiding it from the Prime Minister? I'm kind of not clear on this. And did the Prime Minister find out about it at some point and approved it?
Best disguise yourself. The human eye has a limited exposure range, and standing at the right spot of a light cone can actually make it very difficult to see you or make out clear details. These skills would be critical for a spy undercover or behind enemy lines, who would need to utilize them to effectively use the next skills taught to all Camp X recruits: how to kill with knives, blades, and bare hands. Sometimes a gun is simply too loud, or perhaps a spy might find themselves disarmed or out of ammunition. Knowing how to kill quickly and quietly can make the difference between life and death, and various hand-to-hand techniques were taught to Camp X recruits early in their training. These combat styles could range from traditional boxing to techniques used by African bushmen and Asian guerrillas. Here once more, the British Empire's sprawling nature helped pull together disparate techniques from around the world and distill them down to a cohesive fighting style. Former Shanghai policeman Major Dan Fairbairn also famously taught at Camp X briefly, bringing with him Eastern martial arts. He would eventually make the move south to train the Americans directly, but not before instilling his philosophy that no form of combat was out of bounds in a fight for your life, including a swift kick to the enemy's testicles. Fairbairn had been involved in over 600 fights or riots during his time in China, and he brought nearly 13 years of experience brawling and stabbing Chinese criminals and separatists to Camp X. He would go on to create a specialized blade still carried by modern spies and commandos, the Fairbairn Sykes knife, a stiletto-like blade that was lethal in the right hands. However, spies also need to know how to remain inconspicuous. These techniques covered various things such as how to look as if you weren't paying attention to a sharp-eyed guard when you were in fact carefully noting the number and composition of a passing strong German unit. Such techniques for gathering intelligence in plain sight were critical for spies operating within enemy or occupied civilian populations, as German intelligence agents were themselves constantly on the lookout for informants and allied spies as German units maneuvered throughout Europe. A good spy, however, also had to look the part of a normal civilian wherever in the world he or she was sent, and thus the training would also cover cultural customs and even dress in various regions of the world. To help foment dissent and raise resistance movements, Camp X recruits were also trained in the forging of documents to fool German officials and the creative propaganda. Here the British were also quite adept, but they had learned many lessons from Germany's masterful use of propaganda within its own borders and in occupied territories. Propaganda would often lead directly to a Camp X recruit's next objective, raising and training a guerrilla movement. Thus, recruits were taught how to be good teachers themselves, as well as how to create a variety of improvised weapons and explosives for use for sabotage and to equip a guerrilla force with. Explosives training was a major part of Camp X training, and with so many recruits training in the handling of explosives, the few local residents that did exist were routinely subjected to far-off blasts or detonations. This was to Camp X's disadvantage, as no facility could.
You just see that some, farmer from Ontario just kept hearing gunfire and explosives, and it's like, what is going on here?
Remain secret for long if it was constantly blowing stuff up. However, it inadvertently helped cover up its real purpose, as the facility was soon believed to be used for experimentation with explosives. Lastly, recruits were trained in a variety of firearms, including not just American and British models, but German as well. A good spy would need to be able to pick up and operate any firearm they came across, and Camp X would feature special training for spies operating in different parts of the world, ensuring that each recruit knew how to handle any firearm models native to the region. However, marksmanship wasn't the only thing that mattered in forging a future spy, and Camp X recruits underwent rigorous training in what came to be known as instinctive gunfighting. This technique, also still taught today, involves familiarizing an individual with a firearm so intimately that they're able to lay down effective and accurate fire without even looking down the weapon's sights. While training techniques differ, typically an individual is taught how to use a firearm from the hip at various predetermined ranges. For example, an individual might be trained to shoot from the hip accurately at a range of 10 meters, then a range of 20 meters, and so on. Eventually, the individual is so familiar with firing from the hip at specific ranges that they're able to accurately measure the distance to a target and place effective fire on target without bringing the weapon sights up to their eye. It's a difficult skill to master, but much like riding a bicycle, once one has the hang of it, firing from the hip accurately becomes instinctive. While each trainee received all this,
I wouldn't know. Contrary to popular belief, not all Americans have guns. I don't have a gun, and I've never once in my life fired a handgun, so I wouldn't know.
General training, each group's instructor was completely free to modify or edit the curriculum as they saw fit. Often, groups of trainees would have their training modified for their specific part of the world or missions they would undertake. Thus, trainees tasked with carrying out human intelligence gathering operations in Eastern Europe would have different training from those tasked with blowing up Japanese infrastructure in China. Training was intense, and there was no telling when a new training exercise would take place. Recruits could be sitting at chow or in the middle of a classroom lecture when suddenly it would be interrupted by a mock gun battle. Afterwards, the recruits were grilled with questions such as number of attackers, number of rounds fired, uniforms worn by the attackers, and what types of weapons they were carrying. This was to best simulate reality in a real-world operation when the chaos would be unleashed at any moment. After 10 to 11 weeks of intense training, graduates would either be sent on their first missions or sent for additional training elsewhere. However, those recruits showing great proficiency with electronics and code breaking would be invited to join Hydra Radio. The top-secret radio facility was installed within the training grounds themselves and had windows 7 feet high so as to prevent any snooping from the outside. Inside this nondescript radio room, top-secret messages were exchanged with spy agencies and spies all over the world. Their coded messages relayed from one radio station to another. Hydra was where all important intercepts of German U-boats from South America were dispatched to be decrypted. Camp X was one of the most secret installations the Allies ever operated during the war, but there's a reason to believe that the Germans were not only
So I've heard that the German U-boats actually, got so close in Canada that they sailed under the St. Lawrence River. We do know that there is a sunken U-boat right off of Long Island where I live, probably looking to sabotage ports in New York City. And it's still there and people dive it. It's interesting.
aware of Camp X, but actively took steps to sabotage it. Some of the most mysterious deaths of World War II would occur to Camp X personnel. One of these deaths was that of a 29-year-old political warfare instructor, Kenneth Wilson. Wilson was dispatched to Toronto to train agents at Camp X and driven to and from the camp to his hotel via staff car. Early one morning, though, he phoned the hotel assistant manager asking if a doctor was present. The manager offered to fetch one, but Wilson said he was feeling better and to disregard the request. At about 9:30 a.m., though, he once more asked for a doctor and one was immediately dispatched. The doctor saw Wilson, who appeared to be in good health, and stayed with him for an hour before leaving. Suddenly, around 11:15 a.m., Wilson's condition rapidly deteriorated. Before doctors could arrive back to the hotel, Wilson was dead from sudden heart failure. Another incident involved the death of 25-year-old Howard Benjamin Burgess, who had just been made chief instructor. Suddenly, one day, he simply dropped to the ground unconscious while at Camp X. By the time the camp doctor arrived, Burgess was bleeding from various orifices. He would die 3 days later, the official cause listed as cerebral hemorrhage. Interestingly, the official records from the death certificate and burial permit showed that he died from acute glomerular nephritis, a wasting kidney disease which should have left Burgess an emaciated mess before killing him, which stands in stark contrast to the young, healthy 25-year-old that dropped dead suddenly in 1942. To add to the mystery, one retired head nurse broke a vow of silence to say that Burgess had actually died of a gunshot wound to the right temple. Training accident, or perhaps German assassins and saboteurs? There's reasons to believe the Nazi spies were themselves actively trying to kill key Allied spies. The legendary Major Dan Fairbairn himself was nearly the victim of possible sabotage when the building he was sleeping in suddenly went up in ferocious flames. While no one was ultimately killed and Fairbairn saved by 2 guards who pulled him through an open window, the fire was fierce enough to raise the entire building. Could this have all been a coincidence, or were Nazi spies really trying to eliminate the Allies' most senior and experienced spy trainers? We may never know, because any records of such activities were either never kept or ultimately lost after the war. What we do know is that the men and women of Camp X would go on to play a pivotal role in winning the war both in Europe and the Pacific, and the free nations of the world owe them a deep debt of gratitude. Now,
So I actually was trying to stop and I screwed it up, but at the last graphic there was the American flag, the British flag, the Canadian flag of the World War II era, the ensign flag, and the maple leaf flag. And so one might ask themselves, did infographics screw that up? But I think in looking for a video on this topic, I saw a picture of the Camp X site today, and I think that all those flags are actually flying over the site today. So I think that's where that comes from. Is it like something you can visit, like a museum or a national monument? Love to hear, as always, your comments and your knowledge to supplement what I just saw. And this was really cool. Very interesting to see sort of how, the U.S. intelligence apparatus, perhaps the Canadian intelligence apparatus, was born based on the experience of our British cousins. All right, my friends, this was very good. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you soon. Take care. I'm interrupting this video because after watching the whole thing, it was bothering me a little bit about what they said in the beginning, that I felt like they never closed the loop on, that Mackenzie King didn't know about Camp X. And it just struck me as totally implausible. And then they just never really, explained that. And I looked further into it, and what I understand is that, it's not like the British started this in secret and the Americans knew about it and the Canadians didn't. That wasn't true. And it's kind of the impression that I was left with after I watched this video. So, what actually happened was, yes, they did sort of keep the full extent of what it was from Mackenzie King to give them plausible deniability, because they thought there'd be too much opposition in Parliament. But this was absolutely known to and managed and run by the Canadian Minister of Defense and the Canadian military. The British were the ones who were operating it for the most part. The CO, the commanding officer, was British. A Canadian Brit in the British military was the one who conceived of it. There were Americans, that came up before we got into the war, particularly FBI agents, because J. Edgar Hoover was interested in it, that were observing. It really only opened. They conceived of it and built it in 1940, 19, but by the time it was operational, it was December of 1941, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor December 7th. I think it opened on December 6th. And so, we all were in it together at that point. The CO of it in 1943 or 44, I can't remember what they said, changed over from a member of the British military to a member of the Canadian military, and the Canadian Army trained there as well. The other thing I learned is that the Americans called it the camp. The OSS is the precursor to the CIA, and in homage to, or I guess in French, in homage to this camp that the American intelligence community respected very much, they started calling the CIA training camp the farm, and that's where it came from. It came from Camp X, calling it the farm. I just had to say it. Because it was bothering me. And that's my interruption.